The first thing Edric noticed about Ashvale Manor was that it did not welcome him. The windows were narrow, the corridors cold, and his new wife, composed, courteous, and entirely unreachable, had asked him, on the second day, never to enter the East Wing. She had said it so gently that he had almost missed it. Almost. On the 8th night, past midnight, he heard it, a single piano note rising from the sealed wing, slow and deliberate, like the beginning of something that had decided, at the last moment, not to be heard. He looked down the corridor. His wife's light was still burning. She was awake. She had heard it too. And she had not moved. There was a locked door, a key he had not yet used, and a woman carrying something heavy enough to seal an entire wing of her own house. Before this honeymoon was over, he would find out what was behind that door. What he found would not be what he expected. And it would change everything. If this story is already pulling you in, stay. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. New episodes arrive every week, and they are always worth the wait. Ashvale Manor stood at the edge of the moors like a sentence left unfinished. Its stone walls were the color of old ash, its iron gates tall enough to discourage even the most determined visitor, and its windows, long, narrow, and perpetually shadowed, gave the impression of a house that had learned, long ago, to keep its curtains drawn. It was not a ruin. It was something more unsettling than that. It was a house that had once been full and had chosen, at some point, to become empty. The Duke of Ravenscroft, Lord Edric Thorne, arrived on a gray October afternoon with 2 trunks, a modest retinue, and the particular discomfort of a man who had just married a woman he did not yet know. The wedding had been arranged in 6 weeks, a matter of family obligation on his side, financial necessity on hers, and the ceremony itself had been brief, elegant, and almost entirely devoid of warmth. He had placed the ring on her finger. She had not trembled. Neither had he. They had both considered that a reasonable beginning. His new wife, Miss, now her Grace, Rowena Fitch, had said very little during the carriage ride from London. She had looked out the window for most of the journey, her gloved hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was either composure or exhaustion. When Ashvale Manor finally appeared on the horizon, he had watched her face carefully. She had not smiled, but something in her expression had shifted, a tightening around the eyes, almost imperceptible, as though the house had said something to her that it had not said to him. By the 3rd day, Edric had noticed a pattern. Rowena was, by every measurable standard, a perfectly agreeable companion. She was articulate at dinner, unhurried in conversation, and possessed of an intelligence she deployed with quiet precision, never showy, never careless. She answered his questions fully. She asked her own with genuine curiosity. She was, in every visible way, present. And yet there was a part of her that remained at a permanent, courteous distance, like a candle burning behind glass. She smiled often. At breakfast, when he made an offhand remark about the weather. At supper, when the cook sent out a dish that was slightly too salted, and they both registered it at the same moment. She smiled at the housekeeper, at the old gardener who brought herbs to the kitchen door, at the gray cat that had apparently lived in the manor long before either of them. But Edric, who had spent enough years in drawing rooms to know the difference, could not recall hearing her laugh, not once, not even close. He told himself it did not matter. They were strangers bound by contract, not sentiment, and expecting laughter from a woman who had no particular reason to feel joy seemed not only unreasonable, but unkind. Still, the absence of it settled somewhere in the back of his mind. Not as suspicion, not yet, but as a question he had not yet found the right words to ask. Something in this house, or in this woman, or in the particular combination of the two, was held carefully in place. And carefully held things, in his experience, had a reason for being so. It was Rowena herself who had mentioned it, on the evening of their second day, in the same tone one might use to point out a loose step on a staircase. The east wing, she had said, was not in use. The rooms there had not been properly maintained and were, in her words, not suitable for habitation. She had said it while pouring tea without meeting his eyes, and had moved the conversation forward so smoothly that Edric had found himself discussing the condition of the grounds before he had quite registered what had happened. He had not thought much of it at the time. Old manors were full of unused rooms, sealed parlors, forgotten nurseries, entire corridors that time had quietly retired. It was not unusual. What was unusual, he reflected later, was the specificity of her phrasing. Not "we don't use that wing" or "it needs repairs," but something closer to a boundary, a line drawn with the lightest possible hand, but drawn nonetheless. She had not forbidden him. She had simply made clear, with perfect civility, that she would prefer he did not go. Over the following days he noticed other small things. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin, a compact, watchful woman who had served the Fitch family for decades, always paused for just a fraction too long before answering any question that touched on the east wing. One of the younger maids had visibly stiffened when he had asked, casually, how many rooms the manor contained in total. No one had been rude. No one had refused to answer, but the silence that surrounded that part of the house had a texture to it, the way certain silences do when they are being deliberately maintained. On the fifth day, a practical matter brought him closer to the east wing than he had previously ventured. A section of the main corridor's ceiling had developed a troubling damp patch overnight, and the steward had suggested the source might be traced to the adjoining rooms. Edric had followed him as far as the heavy oak door that marked the boundary of the sealed wing, and there he had stopped. The door had a lock he had not seen before. The lock was older than anything else in the house, a different metal, a different era, installed with clear intention. There was a second keyhole, partially obscured by years of disuse, positioned low on the frame as though whoever had fitted it had not wanted it easily noticed. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure this door could be locked from either side. Someone had locked that door from the inside, and whoever had done so had either left through another exit or had never left at all. He stood there longer than the situation required, his hand resting lightly against the wood, listening to a silence that seemed, somehow, to listen back. He did not ask Rowena about it that evening. He sat across from her at dinner, watched her speak with quiet eloquence about a book she had been reading, and made the deliberate choice to wait. Not because he suspected her of anything terrible, but because he had learned, in his years of navigating complicated situations, that the questions most worth asking deserved the right moment. He would not startle whatever truth lived behind that door. He would approach it the way one approaches something fragile, slowly and with both hands visible. It was past midnight when he heard it. He had been unable to sleep, a familiar condition since arriving at Ashvale, where the silence was so complete it had a weight to it, and had been sitting in the library with a glass of brandy and a book he was not truly reading. The sound was faint, barely there, a single note, low and sustained, like the beginning of something that had decided, at the last moment, not to continue. It came from the direction of the east wing. He set down his glass with the careful precision of a man who does not want to make a sound. and he listened. It did not repeat. The manor returned to its vast, practiced quiet, and he remained in his chair for a long time afterward, very still, turning the sound over in his mind. It could have been the house settling. Old stone and old timber had their own language, especially in autumn. It could have been wind finding a gap in a window frame. He was a rational man, and he had rational explanations available to him. He chose not to use them, because what he had heard had not sounded like a house. It had sounded like a note played once on a piano by someone who had pressed the key and then thought better of finishing the phrase. And when he finally set aside his book and walked quietly to the corridor outside Rowena's room, he could see, in the narrow gap beneath her door, that her light was still burning. She was awake. She had been awake when the sound came, and she had not come out. Whatever that sound meant to her, she had heard it too, and she had decided, again, to keep it behind a closed door. He had a key he had not yet used, a sound he had not yet explained, and a wife who burned her candle past midnight while something played a single note in a sealed wing of her own house. He told himself he would wait. He told himself he was a patient man, but patience, in a house like Ashvale, had a way of running out before morning. He began, the following morning, to ask questions in a different way. Not directly. Direct questions about the East Wing had already proven unproductive, but sideways, the way one might approach a skittish animal. He asked the gardener how long he had worked at Ashvale. 43 years, the old man said, without hesitation. He asked which parts of the grounds required the most attention. The east-facing beds, the gardener said, because the soil there held water poorly. And then, almost without transition, Edric asked whether the east wing of the house had always been closed. The gardener had gone very quiet, turned back to his work, and said only that some things at Ashvale had always been the way they were. Mrs. Aldrin was more composed, but no more forthcoming. When he found her in the linen room that afternoon and asked, with deliberate gentleness, whether the East Wing had ever been in regular use during the years she had served the family, she had folded a pillowcase with extraordinary precision before answering. She said that the wing had been closed for some years now. She said it had been Her Grace's, the previous Her Grace's, she corrected herself quickly, decision to seal it. She said this in the tone of a woman who had decided, long ago, exactly how much she would say on this subject, and not one word more. He thanked her. She did not quite meet his eyes. What struck him most was not the refusal itself, but the consistency of it. The servants at Ashvale were not conspiring. He could see that clearly enough. They were not exchanging glances or telling deliberate lies. They were simply people who had been living alongside a silence for a very long time and had grown so accustomed to its shape that they no longer questioned whether it should exist. Whatever had happened in that wing, it had not been hidden from them by deception. It had been hidden by habit, by loyalty, and by the particular mercy that long-serving staff sometimes extend to families they have watched suffer. He found the key on the 8th day, entirely by accident. He had been examining a writing desk in the library, a beautiful old piece with more compartments than any desk reasonably needed, when a small drawer, stuck for what appeared to be years, had given way under gentle pressure and produced, among a collection of dried ink nibs and a folded letter he did not read, a single iron key. It was old. It was the right size. He knew before he had fully registered knowing. He did not go immediately. He sat with the key on the desk in front of him for the better part of an hour, considering what he was about to do. Rowena had not forbidden him, not in explicit terms. She had drawn a line with courtesy, and he had, until now, respected it. But he was the Duke of Ravenscroft, and this was now, by law and by marriage, his house too. And something in that east wing had played a piano note in the middle of the night while his wife lay awake behind a closed door. He was done pretending that was not his concern. He went in the late afternoon, when the light was still sufficient and the household was occupied with its routines. The key turned with less resistance than he expected, as though the lock had been maintained even in the wing's long disuse, as though someone had wanted it to remain functional. The door opened onto a corridor that was dim but not dark, dusty but not ruined. The air inside was cold in a way that felt preserved rather than neglected. He walked slowly, past closed doors, past a window whose curtain moved slightly in a draft from somewhere, until he reached the last room at the end of the passage, the one whose door stood, unlike all the others, slightly ajar. The room was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. It was not a ruin. It was not a crime. It was, in many ways, a perfectly ordinary room. A sitting room of modest proportions with a fireplace that had not been lit in some time, 2 armchairs arranged toward it, a writing table near the window, and a small upright piano against the far wall. What made it extraordinary was not any single object, but the accumulation of them. The sense that this room had been lived in, genuinely lived in, by someone who had needed it deeply. There were books on the table, not decorative, but read, their spines bent, their pages marked with small slips of paper covered in handwriting he did not recognize. There were drawings pinned to the wall above the writing table, botanical sketches of considerable skill, unsigned. There was a shawl draped over the back of one of the armchairs, faded to a pale rose, as though it had once been a brighter color, and the years had quietly taken that from it. Everything in the room had the quality of something chosen carefully and returned to often. This had not been a guest room. This had been someone's place. And then he saw, on the writing table, a small portrait in a silver frame, a woman, not young, perhaps 40, with a composed expression and eyes that had the particular quality of people who have decided to find things beautiful, despite having every reason not to. He picked it up carefully. He had never seen this woman before, but something in the set of her mouth, in the way her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that was either composure or exhaustion, made something turn over slowly in his chest. He had seen that exact posture before. He saw it every morning at breakfast. He set the portrait down and stood very still in the cold room, understanding, for the first time, that he had married a woman carrying a grief he had never once thought to ask about. He stayed in the room longer than he intended. There was something in it that made leaving feel like a discourtesy, as though whoever had belonged to this space deserved at least the acknowledgement of being witnessed. He moved slowly, touching nothing except what he had already touched, reading nothing he had not already begun to understand. The drawings on the wall were all of plants native to the moors surrounding Ashvale, heather, gorse, the small, stubborn wildflowers that grew in the gaps between stones. Someone had spent considerable time outdoors, observing carefully, recording what they saw with a patience that spoke of someone who found consolation in attention. On the piano's music rest, a single sheet of handwritten music remained, the ink slightly faded but entirely legible. It was not a complete composition. It ended mid-phrase, the last measure trailing off as though the person writing it had been interrupted or had simply stopped, mid-thought and not returned. He did not play well enough to decipher it by sight alone, but he recognized, from the shape of the notation, that it was something slow, something that had been written by someone sitting with a feeling rather than trying to escape it. He stood before the piano for a long time, looking at that unfinished phrase. The writing table yielded one more thing he had not expected. Not a letter, not a journal, but a small bundle of pressed flowers tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. They were the same wildflowers from the drawings on the wall. Someone had brought them inside, pressed them carefully between heavy books, and kept them here, in this sealed room, as though preserving them mattered even when no one else would ever see them. He thought of Rowena's hands folded in the carriage. He thought of her smile that never quite reached laughter. He thought of a candle burning behind glass, present, warm, and entirely unreachable. And he felt, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had been looking at this woman without seeing her at all. He found her in the garden just before dusk, standing near the east-facing beds the gardener had mentioned, her coat pulled close against the October wind. She was looking at something in the soil, perhaps nothing, perhaps something only she could see, and she did not hear him approach until he was close enough that retreat would have been obvious. She turned. She saw his face, and in the single unguarded second before she composed herself, he saw something move across her expression. Not guilt, not anger, but the particular look of someone who has been waiting, without admitting it, for a moment that has finally arrived. He did not speak immediately. He stood beside her and looked at the same patch of garden she had been looking at, giving her a moment he was not sure she wanted, but suspected she needed. The wind moved through the dry grass along the moorland edge. Somewhere in the house behind them, a door closed. When he finally spoke, he asked only one question, and he asked it quietly, the way one sets down something fragile. Who was she? Rowena did not answer at once. She looked at the garden for another long moment, and when she finally turned to face him fully, the composure was still there. It was, he was beginning to understand, a composure she had built over many years and would not simply discard because someone had asked a question. But beneath it, in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze, there was something else. Not defiance, not fear, something closer to the expression of a person who has carried a heavy thing alone for so long that they have almost forgotten what it would feel like to set it down. She said, "She was my mother, and this house never forgave her for being unhappy in it. If you are still here, and something tells me you are, make sure you are subscribed." This story is only getting deeper, and you do not want to find yourself locked out before the best part. Rowena did not return inside immediately. She stood in the garden with the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair and told him, in the measured, unhurried way of someone reciting something they have rehearsed only in their own mind, never aloud. Her mother, Constance Fitch, had come to Ashvale as a young bride, not unlike Rowena herself, brought by arrangement, by necessity, by the particular mathematics of families who had more pride than money, and more expectations than either. She had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable feeling, in a house that had no use for it. Constance had not been mistreated. Rowena was careful to say that clearly, as though she had anticipated the assumption and wanted to correct it before it formed. Her father had not been a cruel man. He had been an absent one, absorbed by his estates, his obligations, his own interior world, which had apparently had very little room for anyone else's. Constance had learned, over the years, to take her feeling somewhere it would not inconvenience anyone. She had taken it to the East Wing, to the piano she had brought from her own family's home, to the drawings she made of the moors she had come to love despite never having chosen them, to the pressed flowers and the unfinished music and the portrait painted by a traveling artist who had stayed at Asheville one spring and noticed, perhaps more than her husband ever had, that she was worth looking at carefully. When Constance died, 7 years ago, quietly, in early spring, in the way that people sometimes go when they have been tired for a very long time, Rowena had sealed the wing herself, not to hide it, not out of shame, but because she had not known what else to do with a grief that had no clean edges, a grief that was partly for her mother and partly for the life her mother had never quite been allowed to live, and partly, though this she said last, and said quietly, for the fear that she herself was already beginning to repeat it. She had told him about the room. She had told him about her mother. But she had not yet told him about the letter, the one still sealed, still unread, still sitting in the deepest drawer of a writing table in a cold room at the end of a locked corridor. And some letters, once opened, make it impossible to see everything that came before them in the same way again. He had listened without interrupting. When she finished, the garden was nearly dark, and the first lights of the house had come on behind them, warm and distant. He had nodded once. He had said he was sorry, and he had meant it, though he could hear, even as he said it, that the words were insufficient. Then he had walked back into the house, and he had gone to his room, and he had closed the door. Not in anger, not in judgment. In the particular retreat of a man who has received more truth than he was prepared for and needs, urgently, to be alone with it. He sat in the chair by the window for a long time, looking at nothing. He thought about Constance Fitch pressing flowers in a sealed room, while her husband moved through the same house without noticing. He thought about the portrait, the composure, the folded hands. He thought about the unfinished music on the piano's rest, the phrase that had simply stopped. And then, with a discomfort that was not entirely unfamiliar, he thought about himself. About the 6 weeks of their courtship, conducted entirely in formal settings, during which he had asked Rowena a great many questions about Asheville's history, its finances, its legal entanglements, and had not once asked her a single question about herself. He had not been unkind. He had been, he now understood, absent in precisely the same way Rowena's father had been absent, present in the room, attentive to the practical, and entirely elsewhere when it came to the person sitting across from him. He had married a woman carrying a grief rooted in exactly this kind of inattention. And his first 8 days at Asheville had been, without his noticing, a faithful repetition of the pattern she had grown up watching destroy her mother. He did not sleep that night. Whatever a honeymoon was supposed to be, the careful, polite performance of 2 strangers becoming acquainted, it had ended in that East Wing sitting room. What came next would have to be something else entirely, something neither of them had planned for. He sat in the chair until the room went from dark to gray, turning that understanding over and over, the way one turns something sharp, carefully, and with the full knowledge that it is going to cut. Rowena had not expected him to respond well. She had not, if she was honest, expected him to respond at all, not in any meaningful sense. She had told him the truth about her mother because his question had been quiet and direct, and she was too tired, standing in that cold garden, to construct another careful deflection. She had told herself, walking back to her own room afterward, that she had simply answered a question, that nothing had to change, that she could return to the measured distance they had both maintained, and he would, most likely, do the same. When she came down to breakfast the following morning and found his place at the table empty, she stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Mrs. Aldrin appeared at her elbow and said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had served this family through many difficult mornings, that His Grace had breakfasted early and gone out. "Gone out where?" Rowena asked. "To the East Wing," Mrs. Aldrin said, and then added, after a brief pause, "He asked for the fireplace in there to be lit." Rowena sat down at the table. She poured her tea. She drank it slowly, looking at the empty chair across from her, trying to determine what she felt. Not relief. It was too complicated for that. Not hope. She had learned, early, to be careful with hope. Something smaller and more fragile than either. The way a single coal can glow in a fireplace long after the main fire has gone out, producing no heat anyone could warm themselves by, but refusing, nonetheless, to go entirely dark. She found him in the East Wing sitting room in the early afternoon, seated at her mother's writing table with the small bundle of pressed flowers in front of him, and an expression on his face she had not yet seen him wear. It was not grief exactly. He had not known Constance, but it was something adjacent to it, the particular heaviness that settles on a person when they encounter evidence of a life that deserved more than it received. The fire he had asked to be lit was burning steadily, and the room, for the first time in 7 years, was warm. He had found, he told her, a letter in the back of the writing table's deepest drawer. He had not read it. He held it out to her, still sealed, the wax unbroken, her mother's handwriting on the front. And she saw that it was addressed not to her father, not to the household, but simply to R. She stood very still, looking at her own initial in her mother's hand, written in the same careful script that had filled those botanical drawings and that unfinished score. She did not take it from him immediately. She looked at it for a long moment, as though deciding whether she was ready. Then she took it. She did not open it in front of him, and he did not ask her to. He simply rose from the chair, moved to the window, and stood looking out at the gray moorland with his hands clasped behind his back, giving her the privacy of distance within the same room, close enough to be present, far enough to allow her what she needed. It was the first time, she realized, that he had offered her that particular combination. She sat down in her mother's chair, broke the seal, and read. The fire crackled. Outside, the moors stretched away into the afternoon light. And for the first time since she had arrived at Ashvale as a bride, the East Wing did not feel like a room full of sorrow. It felt like a room finally being allowed to breathe. The letter was not long. Constance had never been a woman of excess, not in words, not in anything. It said, in the plain and careful language of someone who had thought a great deal before writing, that she knew Rowena would one day marry and come to a house not unlike Ashvale, and that she wanted her to know one thing above all others, not a warning and not a comfort exactly, but something truer than either. She wrote that the rooms we seal are not the problem. The problem is when we stop believing anyone will ever want to open them. Rowena read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her lap, looking at the fire. Edric had not moved from the window. She could see his reflection in the dark glass of the pane, his posture, the stillness of him, the way he was giving her time without making a performance of it. She thought about all the things she had not said in 8 days of careful, courteous marriage, all the questions she had not asked because asking felt like exposure. All the mornings she had smiled across the breakfast table and felt, beneath the smile, the first cold rehearsal of her mother's particular loneliness. She spoke to his reflection first, because that felt easier, addressing the shape of him rather than the man directly. She said that she had sealed the wing because she had been afraid, not of the room and not of him, but of finding herself in a marriage where the most important parts of her lived behind a locked door, and the person she had married never noticed and never asked. She said she had not expected him to find the key. She had not expected him to go in, and she had not expected him, having gone in, to light the fire and sit down and wait for her. There was a silence after she finished. Then he turned from the window, crossed the room, and sat in the armchair across from hers, the other armchair, the one that had always been empty, and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has decided, at some cost to his own pride, to stop being absent. He said, "Tell me the rest. I have nowhere else to be." He had listened. He had stayed. He had said the right things in the firelit room while the moors went dark outside the window. But words spoken during a difficult evening cost a man very little. The real question, the one Rowena's mother had never found a satisfying answer to, was what he would do on an ordinary morning when no one was watching and nothing was demanding his better nature. That question did not yet have an answer. It was still being written, she told him. Not all at once. It came in the uneven, circling way that true things often come when they have been held in silence for too long. She told him about growing up at Ashvale, watching her mother move through rooms that never quite seemed to belong to her. About the way Constance had learned to make herself smaller by degrees, quieter at dinner, less present in conversation, until she occupied the house like a watercolor left in the rain, still visible, but fading. About the East Wing becoming, over the years, the only place where her mother was still fully herself, where she played the piano without apology, drew her wildflowers without explanation, and sat in the chair by the fire without performing contentment for anyone. She told him about the morning she had found her mother in that chair for the last time, in early spring, with the window open and the smell of the moors coming in, and an expression on her face that was, Rowena said quietly, the most peaceful she had ever seen her wear. She had closed the window. She had called for Mrs. Aldrin. She had done all the necessary things with the steady competence that had always been her particular armor. And then she had locked the wing, put the key somewhere she would not easily find it, and had not cried until 3 weeks later, alone in the garden, in the dark, when no one could see. There was one more thing she told him, and she told it quietly, as though she was not entirely sure he would believe her. On certain nights, cold ones, when the wind came off the moors at a particular angle and found the gap she had never been able to locate in the East Wing's outer wall, the piano produced a single note, not music, just one low sound, the air moving through the strings the way it sometimes does in old instruments left untouched. She had heard it her whole life. She had never had it repaired. She was not sure she wanted to. What she had carried since then was not only grief, but the specific weight of a pattern she could see clearly and feared she could not escape. Every time she looked at Ashvale, she saw the blueprint of a life she did not want. And every time she looked at her own composed reflection in the mirror, hands folded, expression arranged, smile prepared, she saw her mother's face looking back at her, and could not always tell whether she was honoring her or becoming her. That fear, more than anything else, was what lived behind the locked door. And it was, she said at last, exhausting to carry alone. He did not defend himself. That was the first thing she noticed, that he received everything she said without reaching for an explanation or a justification, without the particular male instinct to reframe his own behavior in a more favorable light. He sat in the armchair with his elbows on his knees and listened with the complete attention of a man who has understood, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that listening is not a passive act, but a deliberate one, requiring the active suppression of everything that would prefer to speak. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he had spent the better part of the previous night thinking about his own father. Not because the situations were identical, they were not, but because he had recognized in the portrait of Rowena's father a quality he had always told himself was simply dignity, or self-containment, or the necessary reserve of a man with responsibilities. He had told himself that story for 34 years. Sitting in this room, looking at the evidence of what that particular story cost the people around the man who told it, he found he could no longer make it sound as reasonable as it once had. He said he had come to Ashvale expecting a practical arrangement conducted with mutual respect and minimal emotional inconvenience. He said he had believed, genuinely believed, that this was sufficient, that it was perhaps even generous, given what most marriages of their kind offered. He had not considered what it would look like from the other side of the table. He had not asked. And the reason he had not asked, he said, with the careful precision of a man being honest at some cost to himself, was not that he hadn't cared. It was that caring required a kind of attention he had spent his entire adult life learning not to give, because the men he had been taught to admire had all, without exception, kept their feelings behind closed doors. He had simply never realized, until now, what those closed doors looked like to the people who lived on the other side of them. They sat in the East Wing sitting room until the fire burned low, and then Rowena rose and said she was going to dinner, and he said he would follow shortly, and she left him there in the cooling room with the pressed flowers on the table and the unfinished music on the piano's rest. She walked back through the corridor and into the main house and sat at the dining table and ate with the same composure she always brought to meals, because composure was not dishonesty. It was simply how she moved through the world. And she saw no reason to perform collapse simply because something real had happened. But she did not go to him after dinner. She did not seek him out in the library or find a reason to pass his door. She had told him the truth, and he had received it with more grace than she had anticipated. And that mattered. It mattered considerably. But she was not a woman who confused a good conversation with a resolution. Words were a beginning. She had watched her mother accept words for decades, while the actions that should have followed them never came. She would not repeat that particular lesson. She sat in her room that night with her mother's letter on the desk in front of her, and the candle burning, and the sound of the moors outside the window. And she felt something she had not felt in this house before. Not peace, not quite, but the tentative absence of dread. Something had shifted. She could not yet tell whether it would hold. She was not going to ask it to hold. She was simply going to wait and watch and pay attention to what he did next. Because she had learned from Constance that a man's intentions are visible, not in what he says during a difficult evening, but in what he does on an ordinary morning when no one is testing him. The following days were different, and he made sure of it in ways that were quiet enough not to seem performative. He began to ask her questions, not about the house, not about finances or family history, but about her. What she read and why. What she thought about when she walked the moors in the morning. Whether the botanical drawings in the East Wing were hers or entirely her mother's. She told him they were both. Her mother had taught her, and for a time they had drawn together. and some of the sketches on the wall were collaborative in a way that made it impossible to tell whose hand had made which line. He had looked at the drawings again after that, with different eyes. He asked if she played. She said a little. She had learned on her mother's piano, the same upright in the east wing, and had not touched it since Constance died. He did not suggest she should. He did not offer encouragement or gentle pressure. He simply acknowledged what she had said with the nod of a man filing something carefully, and moved on. 2 days later, she came to the east wing and found that someone, at his instruction, she was certain, had tuned the piano. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been altered. Only the instrument, which now held its pitch correctly for the first time in years, ready if she ever wanted it, and entirely without demand. He began also to tell her things about himself. Not grand confessions, but the small, true things that accumulate into a picture of a person. That he disliked London in autumn, but had never said so because it seemed an unreasonable preference for a man of his position. That he had kept a journal from the ages of 14 to 22, and had burned it when he came into the title because he had believed, at the time, that a duke had no use for that kind of record. That the thing he regretted most in his adult life, before this week, had been a friendship he had allowed to lapse, because maintaining it had required a vulnerability he hadn't known how to sustain. She listened to these things the way she listened to everything, carefully, without rushing to respond. And each time he offered one, she felt the distance between them reduce by some small, measurable degree. On the 14th day of their marriage, she played the piano. Not in the evening, not as a gesture, not with any announcement, simply in the late morning, when the light came through the east wing's windows at a low autumn angle and the fire was going, and she found herself sitting on the bench without having entirely decided to. She played the unfinished piece from the music rest first, following her mother's notation to the point where it ended, and then, after a pause, continuing it, not completing it in any formal sense. She was not composing, only feeling her way forward, but allowing the phrase to go somewhere rather than simply stopping at the edge of what had already been written. Edric had heard it from the corridor. He had been passing with no intention of stopping, and he had stopped. He stood outside the half-open door and listened without entering, because entering would have changed what was happening in the room. And what was happening in the room was not for him. It was for her, and for Constance, and for the particular conversation between the living and the lost that music sometimes carries. He listened until she finished. Then he walked quietly away, and when she emerged from the east wing an hour later and found him reading in the library, he looked up and said nothing about what he had heard. He simply looked at her face and said she seemed well. She said she was, and both of them understood that something had been completed that had nothing to do with either of them directly, and everything to do with why they were here. That afternoon they walked the moors together for the first time, not the polite, bounded walks they had taken in the first days, keeping to the garden paths, maintaining the careful choreography of strangers sharing space. This time, they went out past the east-facing beds and onto the open moorland, following no particular path, and they talked with the ease of people who have already said the hardest things and discovered that the ordinary things on the other side of that are surprisingly comfortable. She showed him where the wildflowers grew in the gaps between the stones. He crouched down and looked at them with genuine attention. She watched him do it and felt something settle in her chest, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, but with the quiet, reliable weight of something true finding its right place. They did not have a second wedding. They did not need one. What they had instead was a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after his arrival, ordinary in every external detail. Breakfast at the usual hour, gray light through the dining room windows, the familiar sound of Mrs. Aldrin directing the household through its routines, during which Rowena laughed for the first time. It was not a grand thing. He had said something slightly absurd about the impracticality of the Manor's staircase, delivered with the dry understatement of a man who had recently discovered he was funnier than he had previously allowed himself to be. And she had laughed, a real one, unguarded and brief, gone almost before it had fully arrived. But it had arrived, and he had heard it, and looked at her with an expression she would remember long afterward, not because it was romantic in any theatrical sense, but because it was simply, unmistakably, the face of a man who had just received something he had not known he was hoping for. The east wing was no longer sealed, and Mrs. Aldrin, who had said nothing when Edric first asked his questions, and nothing when Rowena finally answered them, had, without being asked, begun leaving a small vase of dried moorland flowers on the writing table in the East Wing sitting room every Monday morning. She had not explained this. Rowena had not asked her to. Some things at Ashvale, it turned out, did not need to be said aloud to be understood. The East Wing was no longer sealed in any other sense either. It was not exactly in regular use. It remained what it had always been, a room that belonged first to Constance and second to memory. But the door was unlocked and the fire was lit on cold days, and Rowena went there when she needed the particular quality of silence it offered, and Edric had learned to understand that this was not withdrawal, but maintenance, the way a person tends to the part of themselves that requires tending. He had also quietly commissioned a proper frame for one of the botanical drawings, one of the collaborative ones, where two different hands had worked on the same stem, and the result was better than either alone, and hung it in the library where the light was good. He had not asked permission. Rowena had found it there one afternoon and stood looking at it for a long time and had not said anything to him about it. But the next morning, she had placed her mother's portrait on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, in the light, where it could be seen. What the secret room had held was not a scandal, not a crime, not the Gothic revelation that a house like Ashvale seemed to promise. It had held a woman's interior life, her grief, her consolations, her unfinished music, and her pressed wildflowers, and her letter to a daughter she had wanted to save from her own particular silence. And what the Duke had found inside it was not a mystery solved, but a marriage made real. The understanding that the person he had married was not the composed, careful woman at the breakfast table, but also the daughter sitting in a cold garden with a sealed door at her back, carrying something heavy alone, waiting, without admitting it, for someone to ask the right question and mean it. He had asked. He had meant it. And Ashvale Manor, which had stood for decades like a sentence left unfinished, had finally, in the particular way that houses sometimes do when the people inside them stop being afraid of each other, found its way to an ending that felt, for the first time, like a beginning. Every great love begins with someone deciding to truly see another person, not the version they present to the world, but the one living quietly behind the closed doors. If this story moved you, share it with someone who understands that kind of love. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and come back. There is always another door worth opening.